Good evening and welcome to our 66th step of our walking tour through the Bible. And we're going to be looking tonight at chapter 9 of the book of Judges. Chapter 9 forms a discrete short story about the son of Gideon, who is called Abimelech, who becomes king of Israel. Normally, we assume that the first king of Israel was King Saul, but in fact there is an earlier monarch, and that is Abimelech. And Abimelech is the most abysmal creature. First of all, we're told in chapter 9 that Gideon had 70 sons, and he had this illegitimate son, if you like, by a concubine called Abimelech. Abimelech plots with his fellow citizens from Shechem, who are his blood relatives, the relatives of his mother, and he goes after Gideon is dead and he murders his 70 brothers, all on one stone, we are told. And then he has himself proclaimed king. And he says, he justifies this by saying, isn't it better that one person rule you rather than the 70 sons of Gideon? Well, one person ruling means monarchy. So Abimelech sets up a monarchy, and Abimelech's monarchy ends in even more bloodshed. Eventually, he's killed by a woman throwing a millstone on his head when he's besieging a tower. He only lasts for 3 years. But he has a very bad reputation in the Bible. He is a very bad king, and the implication is he's not just a bad king, but kings are bad. It's not just Abimelech is personally bad, but kingship is bad. This may come as a bit of a surprise, because after all, there's a very strong current in the Bible, in the Old Testament, that kings are wonderful. Particularly King David is wonderful, King Solomon is wonderful, King Josiah is wonderful, King Zedekiah is not bad, and of course Jesus himself is the son of David, and he is the king of Israel, so he's wonderful too. So kings are good, but also in the Bible, kings are very bad indeed. And when he kills the 70 sons of Gideon, his brothers, his half-brothers, one manages to escape. And he goes up to the top of a mountain and he declaims a poem. And this poem, which is at chapter 9, verses 7 to 15, is the first example in the Bible of a fable, and it's very easy. Listen to this. Hear me, leaders of Shechem, so that God may also hear you, says Jotham. One day the trees went out to anoint a king to rule over them. They said to the olive tree, be our king. But the olive tree replied, must I forego my oil, which gives honour to gods and men, to stand and sway over the trees? Then the tree said to the fig tree, come and be our king. The fig tree replied, must I forego my sweetness, forego my excellent fruit, to go and sway over the trees? Then the tree said to the vine, you come and be our king. The vine replied, must I forego my wine, which cheers gods and men, to go and sway over the trees? Then the trees all said to the thorn bush. In some translations, it's the bramble. So the thorn bush, you come and be our king. And the thorn bush replied to the trees, if you're anointing me in good faith to be your king, come and shelter in my shade. But if not, fire will come out of the thorn bush and devour the cedars of Lebanon. Now, the idea is that the thorn bush is a bit like a Russian vine, or a bit like some sort of creeper, and it will strangle the trees. In other words, if you really want a king, be careful what you wish for, because the king will make your lives a misery and will squeeze the life out of you. And so it happens, actually, as we read on about Gideon, how the whole place, sorry, not Gideon, Abimelech, how the whole place collapses into anarchy. Then eventually he has a shame of being killed by a woman who drops this millstone on his head and cracks open his skull. And he asks his sword bearer to run him through so he can avoid the shame of saying he was killed by a woman. Anyway, so what does this tell us? Social justice warriors may well sort of say that this is the first expression of human freedom, of, if you like, republicanism, the idea that we're all equal and that nobody should be the king and that we should all be equal. Well, yes, up to a point. This poem that is declaimed, it's clearly much older, I think, than the book of Judges, because it talks about gods and men It dates back to a time before monotheism was the rule. This poem, and which has got certain parallels in their classical literature, this poem is harking back to the time of the judges when there were no kings. There were just occasional charismatic leaders who arose when necessary and then went away, just as in the Roman Republic. If you remember, the guy called Cincinnatus, who was ploughing his field, had to go and save the Roman Republic, but when he'd finished saving the Roman Republic, he came back and took up ploughing his field once more. In other words, its society is an anarchy, a series of cooperatives, a series of people who get together when they need to get together, but when they don't need to get together, all of whom mind their own business. Whereas, of course, the king will not leave you in peace. The king will dominate you, and eventually the king will smother you. And this comes up again when we get to King Saul. So, what is this telling us really about the way society should be run? Well, a lot and not very much. Not very much, because nowadays we live in a sophisticated society with a taxation system, with civil servants, with police, with an army and all this. And we have to have these things. We can't really foresee a way of living which is sort of a loose gathering of cooperatives, which is what anarchists, serious anarchists, would really like. We have to have the huge superstructure of the state, and we have to pay for it. We have to pay taxes. And sometimes it really does feel as we're being strangled by a thorn bush. Okay, so it's not telling us very much. If we think we can go back to the peaceful anarchy of the time of the judges, we are deluding ourselves. Just as all those people in certain parts of America who want to do away with the federal government are also deluding themselves. But at the same time, it tells us something very important, and it's this. The king, or whoever is the head of the government, the prince, the king, the person who has care of the community, is there to serve the people, not the other way around. The people predate the state. The state is to serve the people, not the people the state. We are not slaves of the state. In the later bit, when the people revolt against Abimelech, they start to say things like, "Why are we his slaves? Who is Abimelech? And what is Shechem for us to be his slaves? Should not Jerubaal's son and his lieutenant Zebul be serving the men of Hamer, blah, blah, blah? Why should we be his slaves?" Now, we are not the slaves of the government, I think is what it's saying. Rather, the government is our servant. So the government exists for the common good of the nation. The moment the government ceases to serve the common good, may it end up like Abimelech, with a very heavy object dropped on its skull. So this essentially lays down the bedrock of Catholic social teaching, that the individual comes first, the individual matters, and the superstructure of the state is to serve the individual. So King Abimelech, a warning from history. May God preserve us from that sort of king. All the best. Bye.